Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 46 of the Iga and Carlos Tennis Show. And this is a little bit of a different type of episode we're doing. Our first guest on this show for this year in 2024. And it's none other than Monday Match Analysis extraordinaire, Gil Gross. We've been trying to get this one going for a while. And so I'm happy, Gil, you're able to join Damon and I today.
I'm very happy to be here, Vansh and Damian. Looking forward to talking Alcaraz. Uh, you said this was episode 46? Okay, so my this is perfect because I grew up, the house I grew up in, and I never moved as a kid. So until I went to college, I lived in this house. 46 Valley Lane, that was the address. I won't divulge more for the safety of the person now living in that home, but 46 Valley Lane.
That's amazing because 46 is actually the last two digits of my my apartment number too. So there you go.
Wow.
It's written in the stars. And if you if you divide it by two, it's also the number of my flat. So I guess, that's something that Vansh really likes, all these number parallels. So I usually I would say I'm reaching here, but this is kind of more in line with Vansh and what he usually does with the top 12 players and etc.
There you go.
Anyway, we have a laugh about it a lot. Yeah,
Yeah.
and what we do when we bring a guest here, which it sounds funny because we've only had two guests, I think, before. But what we do when we bring a guest here is we kind of want to get to know like how you got familiar with Carlos Alcaraz. When did you hear about him and what made you tick? What made you think, okay, this is a generational talent that I want to follow, I want to record on, I want to talk about.
Yeah, so I love that. And I kind of forgot about this, but I watched mostly all of his first ever tour level match where he played Albert Ramos Vinolas in Rio de Janeiro. This was February 2020. It was a really long match, and Alcaraz at this time didn't have the big muscles yet, but I just couldn't believe the physicality I was seeing. And he still plays with a ton of energy. Obviously, that was already there at that time. So, and by the way, he was 406 in the world, and you're playing Ramos Vinolas on clay, 41 at the time. And Alcaraz wins in a third set tiebreak, 3 hours, 36 minutes. So from the time I watched him play his first ever match, I was like, all right, whoa. I actually think I tweeted at the time that it was going to be a trivia question. Like, remember the answer to the trivia question: who is Alcaraz's first win against? Albert Ramos Vinolas, Rio de Janeiro. So that happened pretty quickly. And then I'll just fast forward a bit. I don't think I watched him a ton in the first half, midway through 2021 when he was playing a lot of challengers. He was playing a little bit tour level. And then I think it was, well, obviously he had that big Umag run in 2021. I'm trying to think like before then if there was much Alcaraz viewing, or like, if there was a moment that really stood out. I guess it was the next thing I really remember very well was watching the Umag run where he went all the way to the title, and that was big. But what immediately had me sold on him as a prospect was like sometimes it's very simple for me. How quickly do you move? How hard do you hit the ball? And if you're looking at a guy who's moving faster than everybody and hitting the ball faster than everybody, that is such an incredible base to start off with. And it was very clear that Alcaraz was going to have the potential to be an elite offensive player, an elite defensive player. And that's what the best in the world end up being made of.
Yeah, I think your answer is actually kind of what I was thinking because like the 2020 Rio run when he was like 16, that's when
Mm-hmm.
you saw like all those highlight reel points, but you saw like his speed and you were just like amazed at how he was going from defense to offense and like turning these points around and kind of like the stuff that you can't really teach like athletically with like, and combining it with like great touch as well. And like I think he already had the drop shot pretty much by then, but it was kind of like there were so many other things that blew you away that like the drop shot maybe wasn't even like the first thing in mind. Whereas, probably now that's where, he's actually forced a lot of other players on the tour to kind of add the forehand drop shot of their own. So yeah, that's a
Yes,
good shout.
the hype had been building up until that Rio run for sure. Like I remember this being just such a massive thing. I was actually in Marseille at the time because that was the same week. And I just remember coming back from the courts, and watching Carlos Alcaraz until like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. because the second match against Federico Coria was super long too. So I had seen him before in some challenger matches, including the one against Sinner, which right now just tends to have this like incredible legacy. At the time was also considered pretty huge. Of course, 15-year-old against 17-year-old, both super talents. But yeah, I mean, for a lot of people, it's gonna be that Rio run, and it was worthwhile. Like, yeah, it makes sense as that starting point for Alcaraz because that was just like the hype. We couldn't really get it to like delivered at a higher extent. It was just impossible.
Yeah, and then I think that next phase of it was the Tsitsipas win in the third round at the U.S. Open. I got my parents' tickets to the U.S. Open that day. I was working. I watched, I think, the first two sets of that match. Then I had to go work, and I was on other courts. But I obviously went back. I kind of replayed it, and it was sort of the next level. And then I think from there on, it's the entire tennis world basically knows this is a prospect. He's going to be big time. He's going to be a top player. I Another really interesting memory I have from a content standpoint is he played Sinner in Paris. I think their first tour level meeting later that year. Yeah, he played Sinner second round in Paris. Yannick at the time was 9 in the world. Alcaraz was 35 in the world. And I did a video after watching that match. Who's going to be better, Sinner or Alcaraz? I decided to just put my early stake in the ground, and I basically said, I think Alcaraz has more in his game. I think the extra stuff, the net rushing, the drop shotting, the defensive skills in the more desperate situations. I basically said, "Yep, I think Alcaraz is my guy." Between those two at that time, I could have never imagined that it would be what it is now, as basically just the preeminent number one rivalry at the top of the men's game.
Yeah, I think that's all really well summarized in terms of the 2021, and then kind of just how, then 2022 we get to like a year later and he's already number one, and obviously a bunch of things happened that year with like, Djokovic missing a couple majors, and like, the whole US Open draw, a little bit opening up for him, but also just like how he spent 24 hours on court, and then just kind of like everything, we kind of know the rest from there. But it's interesting to hear you guys talk about like 2020, and then like I guess 2019 challengers, probably that's where Damian probably got his you know a good dose of Alcaraz right there.
I think so.
As
2018, he had that big story when he won an ITF match at 14 over Federico Gallo, who was like 292 at the time. But I'm not sure that was streamed. So yeah, probably 2019 would be, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I guess why we're here today is to talk about the top five, right? For the most memorable, and I just want to be clear, like most memorable is like a very broad term. So it's like anything from like, quality, could be like a one-sided win, could be like, could I left it very, very open-ended on purpose, just whatever kind of stood out to you in terms of the match quality. It could be historical significance, could be narrative based, anything you kind of went with. And I'm kind of hoping our lists are somewhat a little different, because that would make this a lot more fun, rather than just going for really obvious answers. But I'm curious. I guess we'll start with you, Gil. What is your number five for 2024 Alcaraz matches?
I actually think we're gonna be different on quite a bit,
Okay.
but I won't tell you why, because I think that'd be a bit of a spoiler. At number five, I went with the Tommy Paul match at Wimbledon. Five was the toughest for me to choose because I almost thought, especially at Wimbledon, there were a couple of matches that were very similar to each other, where Alcaraz got into a bit of trouble, that he was challenged, then he sort of caught fire for sort of a stretch and sort of sprinted through the finish line. And that was certainly this Tommy Paul match, kind of a, just one of, I think, the best first sets of the year, in any Alcaraz match, which Tommy Paul won 7-5. The second set was great. It was 6-4. Alcaraz kind of turned it around there. And then the next two sets, I mean, Tommy was really trying to play aggressive and force the issue, and it got a little bit erratic for him on the forehand side. And third set 6-2, fourth set 6-2. Maybe that's why it won't end up on either of your top five lists. I don't know. But I think the context of the rivalry of Tommy Paul beating Alcaraz back-to-back years in Canada, what those matchups look like in terms of both players ending up at the net so often. Tommy, it just unlocks something in Tommy where he knows he needs to just go downhill, get forward, hit the forehand big. It brings out the best in Paul, although things went haywire a little bit later on in that match, along with just Alcaraz getting pushed really hard at a major. That's kind of my logic why I kind of remember that match as sort of a thriller in the early-ish, kind of midway through the Wimbledon run that would end up being successful for Alcaraz.
It makes sense. I think, I mean, I can't say for Vansh, but I did consider it. I'm not going to have it on my top five. I actually will have a different Wimbledon match, but we'll get to that a bit later, I suppose. However, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. The Tommy Paul rivalry has been so interesting generally. And of course, it's Canada, Cincinnati, where he's pushed him the most. Kind of like maybe, well, still quick courts, just like Wimbledon, but not the ones that kind of give Carlos all that ability to play with his feel, with his touch. But yeah, I mean, for a set and what, like 2-3 games, it was looking pretty bleak for him. And it was certainly an important and memorable comeback. My top five is like a complete bias pick. And this is the one where, yeah, I'm sure neither of you will have it on your list. But I went with Carlos beating Yibing Wu in Shanghai. And I mean, my reasoning is just, yeah, it's like a personal favorite of mine. Simply the shot making feasts that we can get from both players in that matchup. I think just in terms of like sheer natural skill, Carlos is probably on top of the leaderboard in men's tennis right now. But if we had Yiming Wu playing constantly and frequently, and his body wouldn't be hampering him all the time, then perhaps we could get matches like this just time and time again. I remember when we were recording the preview, sort of like for Shanghai. Well, it was more of a Beijing review. Obviously, that was a huge event as well for Carlos. But we were recording an episode with Vansh, and already I was like, I mean, man, look at this draw. If we get Carlos playing Yibing Wu in the third round, and this was also on the back of the match against Yuncheng Shang, another very talented Chinese player, of course, very naturally skilled, and that much doesn't deliver. Like Carlos just comes out, hits ridiculous forehands, and Jerry has nothing to do. He can't really win points on serve. There's really not much about that stands out. And for that Yibing Wu performance, for that match from both players to deliver, I think that was really important sort of for me personally. And I think even like it has some legacy. I've seen shots from this match in like compilations for best of the year or something like that. So it's not like it's completely forgotten. I don't think it should be. Hopefully we'll get Yibing Wu playing much more often and they're gonna just clash again because it was just beautiful to watch.
So actually, I have something similar with both of yours. So for my number five, I chose a Tommy Paul match. So that's a similarity, Gil. And I also chose another match which ended with a similar type of scoreline, only the sets were reversed. So I went with his 6-3, 7-6 win in the Olympic quarterfinal against Tommy. Mainly just because I liked what I'd liked the context and the subtext of what I'd seen at Wimbledon against in the Paul quarterfinals. So just kind of like the next one in the rivalry for me was like, okay, how is it going to look like on clay? Because we've seen them play on hard, we've seen them play on grass. Of course, you have Alcaraz coming in with all the expectations of getting to that Olympic gold match and facing Djokovic again. But before that, I kind of was looking at that Paul match in the quarters, and I was like, let's see how this one looks like on clay. And I think Tommy was playing some of his best stuff that week that I've seen him play on clay like in a while. And the second set ended up being 82 minutes. It was 9-7 in the breaker. There was a lot of tension building there. And I just remember obviously some of the rallies, some of the points, Alcaraz going to the drop shot a ton, but Tommy was just getting to it consistently, and he was coming up with these insane volleys and just kind of matching Alcaraz's shot quality, except for on the forehand. That's where Tommy can sometimes go in and out. But for the most part, it was super athletic. It was super memorable in terms of like I there was a point where I thought for sure this is gonna go 3 sets because Tommy was up 5-2. He served for it at 5-3, and Alcaraz breaks back. Crowd goes nuts. They get into this breaker, and it's just back and forth. And I think he even saved a set point. So at that point, I kind of was like, okay, this one, if he wins the Olympics, this would be a match I'd definitely go back and circle. So I went with that one, but it's something different
So
for
does
all
the
of us.
fact he didn't win the Olympics then, like, ruin the legacy, the magnificence of that then for you?
A little bit, but I also think the silver medal is definitely something. It's nothing to scoff at, right? In terms of when we look back at his year, we're still going to mention the silver medal. We're still going to be like,
It's
okay, he won.
it's the best second place in tennis, right?
Yeah.
Like it means way more than a runner-up at a normal tournament.
Oh yeah.
At a slam? I
Well, I'm
guess,
just
yeah.
saying, I know what you're saying, Damien. Like it doesn't, maybe it's not as historically significant in tennis than runner up at a slam, but I think personal significance,
Mhm.
what's more important in your trophy cabinet? I think the silver medal versus the runner up at a slam.
Sure.
But
I
it's an
think,
interesting one.
yeah, I mean, Olympics are very individual, it seems, for players. But I think we've been saying this on the show for a while that, like, for Carlos and Iga, they are like extremely important, especially Iga, of course, having that semifinal run. And then she kind of has to come to terms with this. But at the end of it, you come up with, I mean, you come out of the Olympics out of Paris with a medal. And that's still a success. And it's kind of the same with Carlos, I guess. So yeah, I mean, in the context of this show, we definitely have to treat it like this. And sure.
Yeah, and of course, we'll talk about it later. But he basically had five memorable tournaments all year, and this is this is the only final. That was the only final he didn't win. But if there was one match, I'd go back and definitely circle in terms of the quality and kind of both players bringing it at the same time. This would probably be the one for me. But
Yeah,
yeah,
Tommy surprised me. Tommy surprised me. I didn't think it would be that competitive a match. I thought Clay was going to kind of ruin a lot of the things that Tommy looks to do against Carlos. So credit to him. That's a good pick.
yeah. Obviously, Tommy's a junior French Open champion, but I'd never seen like that kind of like I've seen him play some good stuff at Roland Garros for a couple of rounds, but this really got me thinking. Like next year on clay, Tommy, I'm gonna be looking for him to potentially max out a little more.
Right, the Rome semis too, right?
Yeah, exactly. But
Yeah, I guess we can get to the number fours then. I mean, who's starting this time? Are we just going the same order every time, or I have no idea.
How do
well,
you guys want to do it?
I guess we can switch it up. So I guess I'll go first for number four.
Okay.
So I actually went with a really one-sided match for this one, just because yeah of the significance, the rival, the opponent, but plus also just ended up winning this title. But I went with Indian Wells quarterfinal against Zverev, and it was a 6-3 6-1 win. But it was memorable for also the bee incident. The whole the bees swarming in his face and kind of just like that whole pause and play. I think it was like 2 hour pause, and like everyone. And I was actually live for this one, so I was on the court. I went for a day to Indian Wells with my dad, so kind of personal significance there. Getting to see tennis with him, and we were so excited to go see Carlos play, and yeah, we ended up seeing something we've never seen before in tennis, which is like the most bizarre interruption. I mean, we've had other animals come on the court before, but nothing like this, where it was just like, you know, the exterminator guy was like the star of the show, and like ends up high fiving both players, and like just the fact that it happened at like 1-all and 1-all 15-all in the first set, and then you basically have to block all of that out, come out, and then and then plays like what I think is maybe his like most signature like impressive win from like start to finish against Zverev, who it was like kind of a windy day and it definitely wasn't the best version of Zverev, but in terms of Alcaraz, like that was the best match he'd played in a long time because he was on this title drought. Like he hadn't won a title in like 10 tournaments and like didn't make a final in the second half of the year after Wimbledon. So kind of this was for me the moment where I started to think like, okay, if he keeps playing like this, he's there in these kind of conditions. He's the guy going forward in Indian Wells for like the next 10 years. So yeah, that would be my pick.
Yeah, I've got some similarity with mine, but let's go snake draft style, right? So it was me and then that way. So now that
Yep.
means Damien, you're up.
I mean, the reason why I smiled instantly when Vansh brought this much up is because that's also my number four pick. I just always knew that I wanted to have one just incredible lopsided performance in there. I was even considering something like Kecmanovic Australian Open, which seems very
Mm.
like meaningless in the long term because after that there came this Zverev match, coincidentally. However, yes, I think Indian Wells might be the best kind of out of that whole category. Of course, he didn't have a strong lopsided win over Yannick. So Zverev this year was the number two, even in the rankings, was kind of the other guy at the top. And I think especially in sort of like the context of the Australian Open as well, the fact that he loses to Zverev, they're very different conditions, but just to kind of prove that he can do it again and to be right back on that horse. Maybe it means more because he won Indian Wells eventually. Like, yeah, if he loses in the semifinals after that to Yannick, maybe I wouldn't have this much. But for me, I guess that was a pretty important one. I wasn't thinking about the bees. I keep forgetting which match it was. Like I remember it's Indian Wells, but I never remember which match it was. But it was a fabulous thing. I mean, just yeah, just seeing that guy with the vacuum cleaner and being so confused about it, and then reading all this lore that people kept bringing up, like his LinkedIn account. Sure, I think it actually adds to the significance historically of this match. This is something we're gonna be mentioning, like the gluing incident at the U.S. Open. These are like things from
Oh
the
yeah.
last few years, the very unique interruptions that might not ever happen again. Although I'm sure that if it happens again, then Lance Davis or Lance David or whatever his name was will be right there in Indian Wells. Of course, I didn't get to see this much live like Vanch did, but that's probably like the best representative I could find of this. Just like Carlos beats a top player very significantly this season, and that's why I went with it for my number four.
All right, my number four is Indian Wells also, but it's a different match. And I also, I guess I was thinking along similar lines as Damian, where I just wanted to say, like, I wanted to throw something in there that was memorable for dominance, for level of play.
Yeah.
I still think Indian Wells this year is the best I've ever seen him play a tournament in
Mm.
general. I think the variety and the patience and just how solid he was and how he was setting up his attacks were just next level. And
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's because it was top of mind at the time where I think Ferrero at that point in time was literally making Alcaraz play drills where he had to hit a high heavy ball before he was allowed to rip one and attack. I just loved the way he was going about things. However, I was calling the Phoenix Challenger that week, second week of Indian Wells. I was kind of busy. It was hard for me to watch all of the matches. Uh, because Alcaraz ended up winning the title for Monday Match Analysis reasons, I went back, I watched the Zverev, and I watched the semifinal against Sinner a little bit later, and then I was able to catch the final live against Medvedev, which is my pick here at number four. I just went with the final against Medvedev. It was also very one-sided. I thought Daniil was just hanging in by a thread throughout the first set. He was finding a way to hold his serve through the tiebreak. And then in the second set, it was just runaway city. It was a 6-1, and it was the cherry on top of a tournament where Alcaraz clearly just found it. I'm a bit of a sucker for finals, so there's that. But maybe I would have put this Zverev thing. A match is never the same for me experientially if I didn't see it live, if I'm going back and watching it after the fact. So maybe that sort of took away from it. But man, I felt Alcaraz was at a pretty indestructible level throughout Indian Wells.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, we
That's
like Indian Wells on this show, that's for sure. I mean, both Carlos Alcaraz and Iga Swiatek, this is like the best court for them, really. Okay, Iga is more like a clay specialist rather than Carlos. Carlos, we've had many talks, of course, about his surface preferences ever since that Rio run, and people kind of considering him a clay bot, but then everything changes. And of course, he doesn't get a clay slam right away. In fact, he wins a grass one before that. But yeah, Indian Wells, like the court profile there is just a perfect mix of what they like. So was that the first double Vanch that we got?
yes. That
I
was the
think so,
first double
right?
that we got since we started the show.
We were
So
looking at like
yeah.
this, since May 2023, which is when I think we started. We were thinking when would this happen? So like the first event which both Iga and Carlos win, and it was Indian Wells, which shouldn't come as a surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
for sure.
remember, by the way, Damian, you tweeted out a clip of Berrettini hitting a forehand winner down the line. And on commentary in Phoenix, I yelled, "Oh my." And you said headphone warning.
I remember listening to you a lot that week, obviously. And yeah, now it rings a bell.
Yeah. So I got a kick out of that. I
That's
got a little excited there.
I mean, can't blame you. I do remember the shot, and of course, Matteo. That whole week was so fun to watch, even if Nuno ended up taking the title. So in that snake thing you mentioned, who's going now?
I'm up. So that
Okay.
oh I throw you off with the snake
No,
draft?
I understand it now. I mean, if you're going up now, then I understand. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
It's funny because I did a draft. I did a under 21 draft, 21 and under draft with Alex Gruskin, and a lot of people just don't know what a draft is, which I didn't realize that. But I learned that by the comments because people were confused. They're like, why didn't you pick Runa? And I'm like, well, because he picked Runa. Like that's, anyway.
It's a very
All right.
US thing, I guess.
It's a
But
very US thing. It's a
Yeah,
very
it
US
is a
thing.
news thing.
sometimes, yeah, sometimes you see these things like Hall of Fame, for example, like when American journalists are like, okay, a player has retired, but is it enough to get into the Hall of Fame? And the whole world is like, why does that matter? But yeah, a draft, I mean, I guess because of NBA, like I'm not even a follower, but I've heard like of the NBA draft when they pick up players, right? So that makes
Exactly.
Yeah.
it's kind of
When
weird that
players,
so many people.
right, when players graduate college, they go into the draft and then the pro
Yeah.
teams have to grab them. I guess there's no soccer equivalent. What can we say, right?
Yeah.
My number three, it's another dominant performance. I went with the Wimbledon final, and it's a strange legacy to this match, just because of the Djokovic meniscus situation, and that will take the shine off of it. But like, let's be honest, like Djokovic was in the Wimbledon final, and he wasn't scraping through these matches. He was winning these matches decisively. He crushed Lorenzo Musetti in the semifinal for the most part. He was serving great. The forehand was on point. So it was very offensive tennis. There's no doubt about that. But then Alcaraz from the very start, I think, they play that really long, I don't know if it was the second game of the match or the first game of the match, but it was a real tussle. You could just kind of feel that it was a lot of, well, first, I think Alcaraz came out really hyped up and he was making some overhit errors. But as soon as that dried up, like there was a huge athleticism gap there, and Alcaraz was hurting Djokovic easily. Djokovic was having a lot more trouble hitting through Alcaraz, and it was after last year's 5-set epic, biggest win of Alcaraz's career, probably still to this day. It was the repeat. It was the back-to-back. It was the channel double, youngest ever to do it in dominant fashion over the same opponent who was not in as good a shape as he was a year before, but just a major statement win. And also, I don't think it's fully fair to just completely throw it off as the guy in the Wimbledon final was so injured that Alcaraz shouldn't get any credit for that performance.
Funny context because we were here in the meeting like 5 minutes before Gill maybe, and I think it was me who made the prediction, and Vansh really agreed that Gill is definitely gonna have the Wimbledon final there. So we were right in that. Yeah, I mean I can't really downplay the significance of it either. I think what I said to Vansh just before we started recording, that this is kind of based on expectations as well, because I know that a lot of people were expecting a thriller. And then when you don't get it, and it's such a lopsided win for Carlos, of course, can be even more lopsided, but he still wins in three. I think that's when you kind of start treating this a little bit differently. But me, the entire Wimbledon, I was just like sitting there and thinking, am I watching a different sport than all of these people who are saying that Djokovic is looking incredible and that, there's no sign of the knee thing? Because I think there were signs. It's just that Rune, he plays him and just has a horrible forehand day on the offense. Musetti, someone who just like can't really put away points. They're playing all these very exciting rallies, but there's no ability from Lorenzo to actually like finish it off. Of course, as you said, very offensive tennis. That was kind of the strength for Djokovic. So I thought maybe if they were playing indoors like he did against Rune and looked fabulous there, like that's kind of his strength. And I guess for most of the season, besides the Olympics final, that was when he was looking the most competitive against Sinner and Alcaraz, when he was just serving extremely well. That didn't really happen on the day, but because of my expectations that like Alcaraz should probably win this in like 3 or 4, that's maybe why I didn't enjoy it that much. It just felt to me like, okay, this is a done deal, and then I was just like, oh yeah, finally, what I was thinking is lining up with what other people are also watching. So maybe that's why for me it has less importance. But yeah, I mean, I can't really like fully disagree, obviously, with anything you said.
Right, right.
Yeah. I think also the most impressive part for me about that performance from Alcaraz was that he went up, 5-4 40 love, and he just blew that game basically. And you're thinking, okay, yeah, I mean, this is Djokovic, like king of comebacks, and if this goes to a tiebreak, all of a sudden the complexion of the match completely changes. But then he actually locks down and plays like an amazing tiebreak, and then it's kind of like he flirted with that danger and he choked, but he won anyway. So
Short memory. Yeah.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
watching that with my dad, and he's like a pretty big Djokovic fan. So obviously, when the whole 40 love game happens, he's already thinking that Novak can win. And I was still, I guess, doubting it, but there was that moment. And indeed, maybe the fact that he played that great tiebreak is kind of the most impressive thing for me about this match. I guess that would take it to number 3, and we'll stay at Wimbledon for me, as I kind of hinted already that I will have one match from that tournament, and it will be the third round against Frances Tiafoe. The reason why, I mean, it wasn't a perfect match by any means from Carlos. I just think it's a very memorable win. This is kind of the Iga Świątek Naomi Osaka moment at Roland Garros. This is I'm gonna, sorry for mentioning it again, but it's gonna be the Misaki Doi Angelique Kerber Australian Open moment. Someone pointed this out to me that I like keep bringing up this very example, and it's true. I mean, I think a lot of Grand Slam runs have a match like this where you have to come through some adversity. This year, of course, for Carlos, I guess, well, at Roland Garros there were a few, but at Wimbledon, yeah, same. But this one seems the most significant. This was when he was the closest to losing, the only five-setter along the way, and the one where, yeah, he just has to lock in that fourth set tiebreak. So I think, especially where we were sort of at that event and thinking, okay, will Alcaraz Sinner eventually happen? Sinner has a tough one against Berrettini the round before. And I was just thinking, yeah, Alcaraz has to get to the semis with the kind of draw he has, because Frances had been doing nothing for months. And yeah, just sort of that feeling of eventually getting that win turned into a title. And like kind of Vansh, I think, hinted with at one of the Olympics matches there, like if Carlos doesn't win Wimbledon, I probably wouldn't have that much in my top 5, but it just grew in importance.
Man, I have the exact same thing. Like
Wow.
I went with that one mostly because it also just reminded me so much of Federer's Wimbledon run in 2012, where he had that third round match against Julian Benneteau, and it was
Fourth
like the
set
exact same
tiebreak as well,
situation
right?
where it was
Yeah.
like a fourth set tiebreak. He was 2 points away from losing, but then you knew once he won that fourth set, similar to this one, that like he was definitely winning the fifth. Like because you just saw, how close Francis came. I believe this match was also indoors. That one was indoors as well. So it just gave me like all the same exact kind of parallels. And also for Francis, it was such a big turning point, right? Like I mean, coming into that tournament, like basically since the Shelton loss at the U.S. Open, it was like a very, very much dejected version of Francis on the court. Like he just wasn't exuding that same kind of joy and playing with that same kind of passion or intensity or focus at all. But then, he plays Alcaraz. I guess he also came back from 2 sets to love against Arnaldi in the first match. But expectations were like very low for him because he was also carrying a bit of a knee problem coming in. And, but then as soon as you knew that he was playing Alcaraz prime time, center court of Wimbledon, you knew he was going to bring it. And he did it like for the most part. And it was kind of an in and out match in terms of both players weren't really playing their best at the same time. Like it was very much kind of like there wasn't really like one standout set where you're just like, okay, this is just like insane quality. But it did the drama did elevate towards the end of the fourth, and that was the pivotal moment for Alcaraz where he was down like 4-all. He was serving at love 30, and once he got
Oh
into the
yeah.
tiebreak, he plays this insane defensive like scramble and he hits a passing shot to then go up 2-love in the tiebreak, and then from that point, I think he never really looked back. And obviously, he almost went out. He almost got pushed to 5 in the next round against Ugo Humbert as well. He was serving at 3-4, love 40 in the fourth. So from that standpoint, these two matches right there were, yeah. I mean, that's what ended up winning Wimbledon and completing the channel double, and for Francis
I was
as well, the summer.
Yeah, I was just gonna bring up the Humbert match. Anybody have that? There's
I
just a
thought of
lot
it.
to choose from. Yeah, exactly. I did too.
Yeah,
There was a lot to choose from in this Wimbledon run, and I was thinking, okay, I'm not gonna put multiple of the Tiafo, the Humbert, the uh the Tommy Paul match, but they were all interesting. I feel like they're offensive players, they're talented players who, for points in time, were playing their best. And we might talk about this at a certain point, but I, players kind of know that they sort of have to redline to a certain extent when they play Alcaraz, and it's a grass court, and those guys have the ability to do it, and they did it. I think I don't have the exact in my memory. I'm sure it's in my notes somewhere, but I'm pretty sure Alcaraz 4-all, love 30. I think he played those points really, really well, like
yeah.
dominant, confident points to kind of squirm out of that hole. And then, yeah, as you said, a dominant fifth. So that's a good pick.
The Umber one, I think, is very underrated. Like that's one where Carlos, there was like what, 4 sets, he wins 3 of them, and he was not the better player in like at least 3 or 4 out of 4. Of course, later in the year, we also saw what Umber can do to him in quicker conditions, and it's not like really, one-time thing. But yeah, that one is also very underrated generally. I think when it comes to just like pure quality of especially the opponent. Yeah, that one maybe gets a little lost right now when people just think of Wimbledon. They don't really remember that one against Umber. But yeah, it should be more memorable. It's kind of like the Jari one in 2023. It's people don't talk about it too much anymore, but it was just as important as some of the other matches that we are bringing up now. Yeah. Vansh, I guess it's your turn now.
Yeah. So I guess for my number two, well, I mean, I have to go for a match between his biggest rival, and that's Sinner. Obviously, given the year that Sinner had, I mean, just like outstanding from like 92% win percentage, and obviously 73-6 on the year, and all of this. But of course, the one pivotal match that they played in the major this year was the Roland Garros semifinal. And I just feel like, a lot of people are going to say like this wasn't a very high quality match. This wasn't like, and I saw a lot of that on the internet generally as the match was going along. And yeah, I wouldn't put it up there with the 2022 U.S. Open quarterfinal or the Beijing final this year or something like that. It was definitely lower quality than that. But I just feel like you have to keep in mind where both players were going through that whole clay season. With their injuries and just Carlos with the arm thing, and then Sinner obviously with the hip issues, and then like, not really looking, we're moving 100% kind of the whole way through. But this match, I would say like when Sinner went up 6-2 2-0, you're thinking like, okay, this there's a very good chance he's going to go up 2-0. But Alcaraz then comes back, and then we get to the 2-1. He's down 2-1, just like he was in the U.S. Open match. And I just feel like anytime you can pull away from your rival in the major count, and you still have a for the most part a pretty high quality fourth and fifth, I think that was generally the best part of the match. And Alcaraz ended up winning both those sets, and he didn't even face a break point in either of them. But the one moment I'll always remember is like Sinner serving at 4-5, 30-15. He had this really easy smash that he should have put away, and like it bounced and he misses that. But from that moment, like Alcaraz pretty much never looked back. And I always also remember in the fifth that he kept hitting those white serves to Sinner's forehand on the deuce side, and like Sinner was just struggling to kind of make those returns, and kind of anytime he had to explode violently into his forehand corner, he just wasn't really able to match Carlos in that department. So I mean, definitely from a Sinner perspective, that's definitely one where like if Sinner wins that semifinal, all of a sudden, and we know about Zverev's issues when it comes to closing deep in majors. You're looking at that and you're thinking now, if Sinner wins that, then it's like 2 majors each. And I just feel like historically, it could be a pretty important match if we look back, and especially since it's all about the majors for these guys. At a certain point, you're that good. It's just about how many slams you can win. So I went with that for number two.
Can't fault you. It was a weird match. I just think the expectations based on the previous Sinner Alcaraz encounters were
Yeah.
through the roof, right? And the tennis just didn't look like we're used to seeing it look like when those two play. It was by far the most nervous Alcaraz Sinner match that we'd seen, and it's like, okay, well, yeah, it's the most important Alcaraz Sinner match, so it kind of makes sense for it to be the most nervous.
Yeah.
But I thought like Sinner's second set dip was weird, and
Yeah. Yeah.
even more so in the context of Sinner's season. And now we know more about what might have been in the back of his head throughout these months of the year. But it's like it was just inexplicable, like sloppiness out of nowhere, and it's maybe the only time all year for Sinner that you could say that. So that kind of let Alcaraz back in the match. And then I thought, and this was the concern coming in for Yannick, not only was it the hip thing, but then he had this illness that kept him in bed in the weeks leading up to the tournament.
Mhm.
The movement really fell off late fourth throughout the fifth, and it was pretty decisive. Alcaraz took advantage of it, as you mentioned, Vanch, like, hard into the forehand. Sinner just wasn't the same. So that's why I left it off.
Yeah.
Pretty
Interesting. Yeah, there's
controversial,
really.
I'd say. But I think I've had conversations about this match sort of regarding like match of the year and how high that would rank. And it's pretty funny because we have so many issues with this, and yet still it ranks very high for most people, and it ranks very high for me. And
Me
your
too.
guys are gonna hate me, but I have it at number 2 as well. We
Wow.
did this exercise already regarding Świątek, and we actually had a shared list there with Vansh. I guess we should have kept it like this because we have a pretty much identical list anyway.
We'll see
I'm
what the number
kind
one
of
is.
sure like what Vansh is gonna have at number one. But yes, for me saying anything about about my number two pick here, I think Gil, you mentioned with the drills that Ferreira was making him do in Indian Wells, like just getting a high ball before ripping. That's kind of when, it came to fruition here also. In Indian Wells, maybe he was trying to break through that, just again, that violent spirit of Yannick's offense at the very beginning. Carlos doesn't know what to do. In Indian Wells, maybe he was trying to do it maybe with like a little bit of slice. On clay, it was not going to work. There's a lot of moonballing in this match, and there's a lot of very smart moonballing. Yes, it's up and down. It's very understandable considering what sort of level these guys were playing at going into the event and just the lack of ideal preparation that they both had because of their injuries. It's still a very impressive event for both, I think, because they just showed that even at 80%, they still dominate pretty much anybody in the field. And of course, this one was very memorable. It's still kind of wild that we haven't had a Grand Slam final between them, hopefully in 2025. So for now, this is kind of like the most important matchup in their rivalry indeed. And I think the fourth and fifth sets, yes, Yannick fell off, but for me, it was also very striking how controlled that was from Alcaraz. Like, yeah, he goes 2 sets to 1 down, but you never really feel like there's that much danger. I guess there was a long game in the fifth set, maybe one of them, but at that point, he's also leading. And yeah, all in all, I just think it's such an important and significant moment. And even if we have so many issues with this, to me, that was one of the best matches of 24, overall, not only Carlos. So for me, it's a number two.
Totally agree. And if I look, it would be in my top five if I didn't want to spread things around and change things up. So my number two is the match after. I went with the final against Zverev. Uh, I just thought it was similar in a lot of ways where, okay, you had some scratchiness from Alcaraz. He goes down 2 sets to 1. And then he doesn't come really anywhere near. It's a pretty clean win. He doesn't almost lose the fourth. He doesn't almost lose the fifth. I think it was 6-2, 6-2. Those final two
6-1,
sets.
even one of them, right?
6-1, 6-2, yeah,
Six
yeah.
one,
6-1,
6-2.
6-2.
Yeah.
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 Look, I think the return strategy was incredible. So as a tactical nerd, I just thought it was amazing how well he neutralized Zverev's first serve, where Alice just wasn't getting much out of it because Alcaraz was on the back fence, basically throwing up high returns, making Zverev kind of generate everything, and he just wasn't able to take control of the points with his first serve, which is what Zverev does to everybody. The Australian Open match loomed large, so it's a revenge spot for Alcaraz. And after what happened in Melbourne, and it's the such a narrative flipping moment. Now, obviously, you have the Zverev side of the coin, which I think brings great intrigue in the tennis world. Is this guy going to get? Is he going to win it? Is he going to get one? And he's a set away yet again. He has a lead yet again, and doesn't get there, which is in a way sort of expected. I don't know if you guys feel like that takes away from it a little bit. That you almost think, okay, 2-1 up Zverev. Now the match starts. Now we see what happens, which I certainly felt that way to an extent. But I still think Alcaraz was remarkable. And the narrative shifting here of, you mentioned it earlier, Vanch, Indian Wells at this point in time was basically the only high in a long period of time from the Wimbledon final the year prior,
Yeah.
where you just didn't have a lot of medium term proof that Alcaraz had the level that we saw, I guess, for most of the year prior, or the year plus prior, up until the Wimbledon final. So this was just the moment where he turned around his season. And he needed to kind of win this final against Zverev to sort of finish the deal there.
Yeah, and for sure, the first 5 or 6 games of that fifth set were actually pretty tight because you had all those breakpoint saves, and then you had the Zverev second serve line call thing that could have made it 2-all, and then you also had you had to save a couple
By
more
the
break.
way, that added to it too. Like, I like that. I like the fact that there was a debate after the match that was unfortunate in a way, but also kind of fun. I like it when matches bring some discourse, and that'll go away, which is good. I'm in favor of that. But I don't know. It's a positive for me what happened there.
Yeah, for sure. And certainly also, yeah, getting that getting the Roland Garros thing off his back finally, because I think a lot of people just assumed that would be like the first major he'd win,
True.
and obviously
Yeah,
wasn't
I
the
mean,
case.
I did kind of like briefly consider it. I guess I already made my decision when I was thinking about matches of the year, like a month ago. I already made my decision that the semis I value more than the final. But yeah, I mean, I was not really treating it as a done deal. Sure, there's that feeling that okay, the winner of Sinner Alcaraz should claim the title, but Zverev, was keeping up with them. Basically, right now he's pretty much the only player keeping up with them on the tour. Maybe Djokovic in some instances.
Mhm.
So sure, it absolutely makes sense. I understand the concerns as well that like, is Zverev able to actually step it up in that key moment? And this match just never really allowed us to have an opinion on that, to have like a second data point after the 2020 US Open, where of course he wasn't ready to take it. But now I don't think the fourth or fifth set we actually learned whether Zverev would be able to do it if the opportunity comes up, which for that reason, I guess it doesn't really take away anything from that much for me.
Start of the fourth set, I think we got some Zverev nerve shakiness. I think. I think there was a little bit of like, whoa, I'm in the driver's seat.
Yeah, and then you
But
saw him get like really passive, and Alcaraz just immediately goes up for love, and there
yes.
wasn't a whole lot that Alcaraz really had to do in that
Fair
moment.
point.
So
Fair point.
I agree with that. But now we're down to the final spot. So
Okay, I'm up. I'm gonna go with my match of the year.
uh,
It is the Beijing final, Alcaraz Sinner, which was the highest quality encounter of the year, start to finish. There are some other, decent arguments for match of the year. Maybe you look at the Olympic final, with which, for me was more of a Djokovic performance than a match of the year, although would be up there. Um, this, on the other hand, was just, awesome back and forth stuff where you have set points in the first set. Yannick hits the big serve, the big return in the tiebreak, winning the point outright off the return to kind of steal the first set, where I thought he was sort of hanging on. But in the past, you might see, Alcaraz sort of dejected for some time after that disappointment. He responded great, wins the second set. Let me skip to the third set tiebreak for a second. If I'm showing an alien what Carlos Alcaraz is all about, like they drop down on this earth, and I'm like, let me explain Carlos Alcaraz. I'm going to show down 3-love in the third set tiebreak against Sinner in the Beijing final, where he just does. There's like 3 or 4 points there. Some of them are just massive forehands where he takes a neutral spot and just wins the point with the sheer firepower of his forehand. Then there were just some crazy plays up at the net. There was a running forehand that he approached off of. No player in the world approaches off of this shot. I mean, nobody's even at the net other than Alcaraz. He ends up making a great half volley and a great play up at the net. And he wins 7 points in a row. So it had the finish, like it had that consistent quality throughout, and it had this memorable finish. And even though it was in, uh, a time zone that was like, it's rough for the United States. It's not ideal, at least for me. It transcends all of that. It doesn't matter that it was after the US Open. It doesn't matter where in the world it was. Like this felt like a really big deal within the tennis season.
I mean, it was the by far the most consistent Sinner Alcaraz we got this year. Indian Wells, you've got that one set where Sinner just demolishes him. After that, well, the second set is competitive, but the third kind of feels like, okay, it's probably done. Of course, Roland Garros, we've already mentioned, and this is when they finally deliver. I think Vansh said that it's all about the slams, but in this case, it really didn't feel like it. And you're very right, actually, that sort of like disregarding time zone, even this was a final played on Wednesday. Even in Europe, it's like 10 or 11 in the morning when they're starting. So a lot of people can't watch it, but everybody just has to, come up with an excuse because it's Sinner Alcaraz and Sinner Alcaraz in an absolute classic. I think especially also where Carlos was heading into Beijing in terms of the horrible US Open swing, that performance against Botic van de Zandschulp, like, the most passionless I've seen him play. because that's also something that people have enjoyed about him since the very beginning, just the intensity and how much fun he has on the court. And he's been saying this, and I think we've also learned it this year, that this fun is instrumental to his success. Like, it's impossible for Carlos Alcaraz to just wing it, just be there and, I don't know, just throw in a very mediocre performance. He doesn't care about the match. He might not win. He might not actually have that hunger, the drive, and it's really such a massive thing in his game. So to sort of see him build it up again at Davis Cup, at Laver Cup, sure, weird competitions, kind of different formats. But yeah, it seems like he's getting it back. He plays a very good match against Medvedev in the semis in Beijing, which I also considered for this list, but I didn't end up going for it. However, there he's like super aggressive on his forehand, and you just wonder, okay, is it going to be the same against Yannick? Because Yannick, like blow for blow, shot for shot this year, has been the best player out of anybody. And of course, we had that like sort of like data from the first sets of Roland Garros and from the first set of Indian Wells, where for the first 30 minutes, Sinner just like has way too much. We also have the Beijing semi from 2023, where Sinner just indeed like violently blasts through Alcaraz of the baseline. And considering all that, I just remember watching the first few games. I think there's like a 40 love lead on the Sinner's serve in the second game, maybe that Alcaraz doesn't convert. But just the forehands he was hitting in that game, I'm already thinking, okay, this is a very different Sinner Alcaraz. Loved it, the entirety of it. So many twists and turns. Of course, the last 7 points as well. Very good peak for that alien that's coming to Earth soon. And I think I had a chat recently about this with Carlos Navarro, whom we already mentioned. And what surprised me is that he said that for him, there was no like clear match of the year in 2024. And he just didn't think that this was at the level of the Wimbledon final in 23 or Cincinnati in 23. Like, for me, this is right up there. I don't know if Wimbledon, because of course it's a Grand Slam final, but the Cincinnati match 23, Djokovic Alcaraz, like this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is like exactly the thing that people, to me, should be picking as their match of the year. Just everybody should be doing it. And this is why I kind of like clapped when you made the Djokovic point as well, because it's something I've been saying too, that this is the Olympic final was a phenomenal Djokovic moment, but I can't really justify it being match of the year, especially compared to this. Like if someone has it at their number 2 slot, sure, I mean, go for it. I wouldn't, but that's not something I can disagree with. But this is by far the best match I've seen all season. This is by far the best Carlos Alcaraz moment all season as well, despite him winning 2 slams. This was massive, and it might even sort of like be more important as we get more Sinner Alcaraz matches, because for the first time in that rivalry, there's actually like a sizable lead for either player. And there's also that story of Yannick basically beating anybody this year, but not Carlos. And what's the head-to-head Vansh between Carlos and Yannick?
Oh my goodness, 7-4 if we include the challenger.
Thank you.
But yes, no, I mean,
wait, was this in reference to people not including the challenger match?
Yes.
Yeah, which
it's tough, I go both ways on it, because in a way I want the head to head, and sometimes even without challengers, I have to adjust it where there's like this is the number, but this is like the real number. Like for example, Zverev played Alcaraz. I think this is right.
Vienna and
no.
Acapulco, maybe?
But, okay, here's an example. Medvedev played Alcaraz Wimbledon 2021, right?
Yeah.
That's not like a real Medvedev beat Alcaraz. Like Medvedev was way further along, way closer to the real player who he is compared to Alcaraz. That's just one example.
Yeah.
So
we have this a lot with Iga, right? Because before 2022 and after 2022 is kind of what you have. Or I don't know, going into the WTA finals, you had Sabalenka Paolini, where people say that, oh, but look at it, Paolini is leading Sabalenka. And the last match was like 2019. I mean, yeah.
No, but for sure, like what you said about like the fact that it was post US Open and like the time zone. This was 2 a.m. for us in the West Coast, but I mean, I stayed up. I pulled an all-nighter for this, and I was like, "There's no way I'm missing, a single point of this match." And it just delivered from the start to finish. Like you could just see it didn't matter. Like I said that slams count, but that's more like the slams count the most, but that's more in terms of like the legacy and like long term when you look at their achievements and their whole body of work. But like this felt like as big as a slam final at some points. You're watching it. It felt like just such an important match, and each and every single point felt like it had something writing on it. where it didn't feel like that. I guess the Olympic final had that to a certain extent with the two tie breaks and like just the, like what was at stake, particularly from the Djokovic point of view. But in terms of a Sinner Alcaraz match, like point from the first point to like 7-3 when he reels off the 7 points in a row, I just couldn't believe the twists and turns and the kind of the momentum shifting moments that occurred because you also had Alcaraz serving up 30 love, really getting it done. But then the player who usually loses the first set in this rivalry so far actually ends up winning most of their matches, which is kind of unique because you think of the top players as like being the front runner, but in this kind of moment, when once Sinner took that first set, and Sinner was on this like incredible roll this year of like tie break streak. He went like 25-8 this year in tie breaks, and there was a point in time where you pretty much it was like the Djokovic of 2023. You just knew like if it was a tie break, you knew that Sinner was really going to step up and just not make any bad shot selection decisions. And for the most part, like Alcaraz was a better player in the first set, but he still lost it, and he almost lost this match 6-3. But just like the moments of brilliance that he had, like it just kind of showcased everything we know about both these players, right? Like we know that Sinner is just like shot for shot, it's mostly going to be at a 9 out of 10 the whole way through, and Alcaraz may dip from like an 11 to a 5, but his peak is like, certainly as high as Yannick and sometimes higher. So it's just for the most part, it just kind of showcase exactly what both players are about, and yeah, that's kind of why there's no other candidate for me really.
Yeah, and the 3-0 is pretty significant because Sinner ends the year as a clear number one, and Alcaraz doesn't even end number two. But
Yeah.
if you're Carlos going into 2025, you feel fine. You're thinking, look, we split the majors. I won all three meetings. You're disregarding the Six Kings Slam. I'm pretty sure Carlos will not be thinking very hard about that one. And you're going into 2025 being like, I'm right there. I'm all good. And I think if the Sinner head to head went differently this year,
Mhm.
you'd feel a lot differently. Like Alcaraz might be feeling like he is at, that he needs to, I don't know, kind of, he's at a deficit, or that it was disappointing how things went in 2024. Like that 3-0 against Sinner, I think is very significant for the mentality and how Alcaraz feels right now.
We've kind of like brought it up a few times by now, but Carlos, yeah, indeed had five memorable events.
Yeah.
He's got about 7,000 points on his ranking, 4,000 coming from the two slams. So what do you think is like, the main thing he can do about this? Like, how can he improve that consistency week to week? And also, is it even important that he does? Because you kind of just said that, yeah, it's not that big a deal. And for the most part, like I agree, in 5 years, or maybe let's say 10, we're mostly going to be remembering two slams each.
I think Alcaraz needs to develop his chin. Do you know what that, you guys know what I mean by that? So like
How
for
to
a
how to elaborate?
so for a boxer or an MMA fighter, it's what is your ability to get punched in the face or kicked in the face? And you don't want that to happen. Like everybody's trying to not get punched in the face. That's the sport. But when it happens, how do you react? And then you also have the famous Mike Tyson quote: "Everybody has a plan until they're punched in the face." And I think the last 2 years, the one pattern, and look, yes, there have been some inconsistencies outside of this specific thing, but I think for the most part, you look at a very emotional defeat at Cincinnati against Novak Djokovic 2 years ago, and then this year you look at a very emotional, uh, tears afterwards defeat against Novak at the Olympics. And it just felt like Alcaraz went into a shell for a month or two after that and was like emotionally and mentally not himself. And you do need to grow out of that. For as much as Alcaraz might play a style that could lend itself to some more, extreme ups and downs, that's fine. But one thing I'm almost certain he's going to get better at, and he needs to get better at, is you're going to take some really hard losses. You're going to get punched in the face. And you want to, and it's understandable, everybody's human. So like you say this with some sensitivity, but you also have to learn how to get over it. Like that's a skill on the tour. You lose, are you right the next week? Or are you still thinking about last week when you show up to the next location? Uh, and I think there needs to be a kind of a look at how can we lose better? Let's get better at losing, if that makes sense.
That's very interesting, actually. It kind of reminds me of the fact that Carlos, I mean, clearly these things like impact him really. Like just the fact that, I don't know, 2023 Roland Garros semi, it's such a big match. He basically doesn't sleep before it, and he gets these nervous cramps and then also the hand cramps in the Cincinnati final. It's not really something you see from most top players. And he's still so mentally resilient. I'm not saying he's not. He wouldn't have won almost anything if he wasn't. But it's kind of an interesting thought that, yeah, these things are impacting him a little more maybe than some other players. And with Cincinnati, we had such a clear, like, I don't know, 5, 6 month stretch where he just wasn't playing his best, and the Olympics may be a little shorter than this, but yeah, it's tough not to note the similarity of this. So yeah, it actually
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and of course the immediate effect was like Cincinnati US Open. That's where like Sinner really separated himself, from Alcaraz, because coming into the US thing, you kind of were thinking, yeah, they're pretty much even, as far as points and everything go. Alcaraz even had the two slams, but that sudden dip where I think many players could have beaten him, when Botic beat him at the US Open, like that version of Alcaraz was just not there. So
Yep.
definitely definitely a good point. But anything you sort of saw in his game technically, tactically, that you feel like was a step up?
A step up this year.
Yeah, like the serve maybe, or something you can point to.
Yeah, I think the serve continues to improve slowly. I don't think there's been a moment. There certainly hasn't been as drastic. There have been technical changes, but not as drastic as Sinners, which kind of gave Yannick this sort of big kind of PR hit of, oh, the serve's better now. So although Alcaraz hasn't had that, I do think the serve is just incrementally getting better and better. But I think the big thing this year was learning when to dial back a little bit. I think, especially compared to the struggling stretch leading up to Indian Wells, where you did have a lot of just high octane power tennis, all gas, no brakes, that kind of led to, whoa, okay, we're making some errors here that probably don't need to be there. You're the fastest player in tennis. You're probably the best defensive player in tennis. So let's play a little cleaner. Like, let's rely on those things a little bit more. And I think Alcaraz, that got through to him at a certain point. And you started to see some safer ways to construct points and build offense with variety. And I think at Indian Wells and throughout clay court season, there was a lot of higher, slower, heavier. At Wimbledon, maybe you saw more slice, more chip returns, and just stuff that he could sort of work in that made him more consistent and made him a tougher competitor. That said, I think through the latter stretch of the year, I would still be a little bit critical of like the backhand and his approach off of that wing. I think sometimes just trying to dial up the miles per hour to a level that just, it doesn't necessarily need to be that when, again, you have the best forehand in the world, arguably. Your forehand, I mean, Sinners might be better, but you have the heaviest forehand in the world. You could say that.
Mhm.
Why not let that do the talking? Like, ripping backhands down the line, not that you can't pull that off, especially, or pull it out, especially when it's 40 love or love 40. And you might have some wiggle room here, especially 40 love. But let's be selective there. Like, that's probably not the way you want to win most of your points. And if you look at just the consistency off the two-hander, I do feel like that can go up a couple of levels just by being a little bit more patient in the approach. And I do think that would make him a little bit better.
Low-key, one of the most important and the best shots Carlos hit this year was that backhand down the line against Sinner in Indian
Yes.
Wells.
Yeah.
Very low margin. But no, I mean, generally, of course, I agree. And there's like a bit of a like dichotomy between Carlos being sometimes like the best match player on the planet, especially in these Sinner matchups, it seems. But then on the other hand, sure, it seems like the big events that he had this year, that was kind of when he saw him playing the smartest. Funny enough, maybe Madrid was also one of these because, I mean, he didn't have the forehand there. Like, he couldn't really hit through it. So it kind of made him have to, just come up with something on the spot sometimes, especially in these matchups against Struff and Rublev, where, like, yeah, his usual play style wasn't really there. So maybe that was also a good learning opportunity. it could be a very positive thing to like kind of just, get out of this. But then again, sure, there were a few events later in the season when maybe he took a bit of a step back. I think on the show we definitely discussed this as well after this Zverev loss in Australia, where like, yeah, he just kind of keeps blasting through his backhand, the stronger wing, and that there's like very little sense on the fast court. There's very little sense of, yeah, there's very little sense. And that's maybe what I
Yeah.
should end it with. And yeah, I think the serve it does keep improving. The biggest jump maybe was actually that 21 season we were referencing. I remember the next gen finals, which of course are happening this week. I remember they were showing this stat where like from the very beginning of the season, it went up like 30 kilometers an hour average first serve speed. But still to this day, yeah, it's like kind of random to me. Like when I'm tuning into an Alcaraz match, sometimes it's going to be phenomenal spot serving, and sometimes it's just like, it's a flat pace coming up, but yeah, there's not much in it. But sure, I mean, these are definitely things he can improve upon. And in fact, speaking of improvement, we're coming up, of course, the new season is going to be there. I don't think Carlos is playing anything again before Australia. But Australia, there's always going to be that big storyline this year, next year, or even the year after that, whether he can get that career Grand Slam and be the youngest player to do it. And of course, last year we mentioned this loss to Zverev a few times already. What do you think he can kind of like improve upon in terms of his Melbourne chances? And yeah, how likely is he to get that career Grand Slam done by now?
It's interesting. Like the Australia, it hasn't been his best, and I think you look at players, okay, how do you come out of off seasons? Like, do you like to come off of an off season? Is that when you play your best? You haven't played a lot of matches, right? Maybe a couple weeks, maybe not. But you've come off of training blocks. And is that an environment where you actually perform at your best? Or do you like to be on your third tournament or would you rather be on your 12th tournament of the year? You've played two in the last 2 weeks. You're just in that match play rhythm. And I think, Alcaraz is so young. I don't think we've seen a clear pattern develop. He's also so good that whatever the pattern is, I'm sure he'll win an Australian Open in his career. But my sense is that it's sort of a scenario that probably helps Sinner and definitely helps Djokovic. And Zverev has played really good tennis in Australia as well. So I would I would have him as one of the top title contenders, but I would probably say that it's his least likely slam of the four. And I know that's easy to say about one that he hasn't won yet when he's won the other three. Very, very easy to say. But I do think it makes some sense. And on the exhibition topic, I don't know if any of you want to, opine on that as well. I'm not an anti-exhibition guy. I'm certainly not someone who thinks that it disqualifies you from complaining about the schedule. That is flawed logic.
Yeah.
But if you're giving me two guys, if you're giving me Onyx Sinner, who has literally not played any and is just focused on making this offseason period about training, recuperating, tinkering, versus Alcaraz, who has done a little bit of a world tour here, I'd still rather take the Sinner approach if I'm predicting what's going to happen in the Australian Open. So I'll throw that out there as well.
No, I'm definitely on the same page with that. Like I certainly think, it's not like flawed to complain about how long the season is or like the number of mandatory tournaments and then, just play a couple of exhibitions for a completely different purpose. So I totally see that. What do you think about some of the matches that he had this year on the fast courts? Obviously, we're talking about Australia, and Australia was pretty quick as well. But like, just some of the players were able to kind of, it feels like, get the most of their abilities against him. Either, I mean, you obviously had Zverev serving at like 85% first serves in and like across four sets, which obviously made it tough.
It happens though.
But then
It's Zverev. He does that
yes.
sometimes.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, he's like averaging above 70 the whole
Yeah.
year. So that's definitely an Alexander's very specific thing. But more so players like Mahach or like Dimitrov in Miami or Ugo Humbert in Paris, where where it just kind of feels like he's rushed on the first shot after the serve, or it feels like his serve and return quality. There's a little bit of a gap there where the serve isn't quite doing enough, or maybe or it's sometimes you get into more of those rallies where it's just a shot here, a shot there, like 5-all in the third against Humbert, and you know matches like that. What is sort of going to be the deciding factor there for him? next year.
Yeah, mainly the first serve, but I think it's been tough for Alcaraz because I think the entire locker room has figured out that you can't really play neutral against him.
Yeah.
Like you have to take control, you have to make him defend, or you're just rolling the dice and hoping that he's going to miss a ton, which frankly it's not a great approach. Like there
Mhm.
aren't a lot of players. You're not seeing a lot of Roberto Bautista Aguts or, you know, I don't know, Jaume Munars or players like that. Maybe not the best examples, but you get what I mean. Guys who keep the ball in the court and that's their MO. You're not really seeing Alcaraz lose to those players. You're seeing him lose to Nicholas Jarry and Hugo Humbert and Tomas Mahach's nuclear backhand.
Yeah.
And I think those players just know it has to be an 11 out of 10. I have to be aggressive and assertive. And it makes them more clear-headed. And then sometimes they play great and they're able to execute it on a fast court. And that's where you're seeing Alcaraz lose some matches. But it's really the serve where Alcaraz can take that aggressive return away. Against like Tiafoe at Wimbledon and like in matchups like that. These are aggressive Struff.
Mhm.
These are guys who are trying to play offense off the return of serve. And the only way you take that away is by serving better. So I think the slice serve, especially on the deuce side, that's the one, that's probably the biggest one to focus on. Get that, hit that spot, slide it out wide with more consistency. Same thing with the tee on the ad. And, the precision just needs to continue to level up because he has the live arm. The pace is there.
Yeah.
The kick serve is really good. But maybe if I were to pinpoint one, it's start locating the sort of 127 mile per hour slice serve.
Yeah. So it's all about basically hitting the spots, keeping your opponent guessing, going for those sharper kind of, yeah, just more pinpoint accuracy basically. But on the back end, it's interesting you bring that up because I actually was reading that Hugh Clark piece that you alerted me on Twitter, and I was just like, yeah, I mean the I didn't actually notice it at first, but I did notice towards the end of the season that he was using that kind of straight arm technique on the
Yeah.
back end, and if that's sort of something that's going to help him in the longer term, maybe absorb pace on better on that wing on that first shot after the serve, or just when he's feeling a little bit rushed. Because obviously on clay and grass, he has other options like the higher loopier stuff. Can use the slice to get himself out of like defensive positions. If he's quick enough, he can even find a forehand on some of those shots. But I just feel like with the hard courts consistently getting faster, like you're gonna see more courts that are playing at that speed now versus certainly 3 or 4 years ago. That's at least the trend.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that the backhand setup tweak. He's got to look at it because I think one of the main culprits in many of his losses post US Open were, whoa, he missed a ton of backhands. Like
Yeah.
the backhand error count was just really high.
Mhm.
So it's something to look at. Sometimes you see technical changes. You suffer a little bit in the short term, and in the long term, it helps you. So maybe the straight arm take back is one of those, or the setup. We'll have to see.
Yeah.
So like the parallels just keep on coming because while you were talking maybe like a little bit earlier about the importance of the serve and also especially how Carlos doesn't really like lose to players who I don't know are just consistent keeping the ball in court. It's like what we've also been talking about for Iga a lot on the show,
Yeah.
right? Because I
Exactly.
think there was a time where like she never lost to a defense first player for like 2 years. I think now
Yes.
maybe it happens with Coco at the WTA finals. That was probably like a defense first performance, but yeah, I mean it's kind of similar. They just have so much quality that you have to just override it. You have to just completely disallow them from using it. And yeah, I mean, definitely the way to look forward at Alcaraz's career is going to have to be how to combat that, especially as the hard courts are indeed now getting faster. We have been complaining about the slowing down of the courts for years, and it seems
Yeah.
like the trend is now very different. So, especially if he wants to win the ATP finals, but also the two hard court slams going forward, that will be pretty massive.
But hold percentage is up. Just want to throw that out. Like long term, like the
Yeah. Yeah.
Matt Willis sent a tweet earlier in the year. It charted it like hold percentages are up. So I just wonder if sometimes people confuse court speed for play style. Like play style goes a certain direction, which has been baseline consistency and simplification of the game and maybe less net play. And
Mhm.
it's like, okay, well, courts are slowing down. It's like, well, are they, or is just the play style, are the play styles going away that leads you to think the courts are slowing down? Just a thought.
Um, I think we had
And by the way,
moments
I
when
think it's
like.
both.
Mhm.
I think it's both. I
Yeah,
think it's both.
I think it's both because we had moments when like every single European indoor hard court in on the ATP tour was like super slow, for example. And yeah, I don't think that was really the case in the past, but sure. It's also the meta is changing, and I've had some chats about this recently where like, now it's really all about the power in the top 100, whereas not necessarily in the past. I don't know, someone like Damir Dzumhur could get to a top 30 ranking, which I just think it's not viable anymore, really.
Who?
And
Who? I didn't
Damir
catch the name.
Dzumhur. And yeah, I mean, I just don't think that sort of playstyle is really viable. I've even heard players like Maximilian Marterer, for example, told me that like he had to adjust to the new sort of like era. He had this one top 100 breakthrough, of course, 2018-19. Then he has a long injury, and then he only gets it like what last year, end of last year, no, maybe even this year. Anyway, end of last year probably. But what I'm trying to say is that even a guy like this, who's like all about the big serve and the +1 forehand lefty, even he has to kind of like adjust to the fact that everybody right now on the ATP tour is hitting so hard, and that's kind of also probably impacting the whole percentage. So yeah, I mean it's a combination of factors,
Mhm.
but now we do simply tend to be drifting towards these faster chords that Alcaraz has to get a little bit better at.
Yep.
Yep, certainly for sure. And the game keeps trending in that direction where like athletes are getting bigger, stronger, faster. But then occasionally there's also drawbacks to that with like more injuries and stuff like that. But obviously, there's numerous other factors, including, the type of balls, and that's a whole nother debate. But nonetheless, nonetheless, yeah, it was a pleasure to talk about Alcaraz in full flesh like this. It's only really a December topic that you can really kind of look back and reflect on what are the high points, the low points, the kind of memorable moments as we look at later on, in we chronicle his career. And we did something like this similarly for Iga, but it was just nice to have another guest and bounce topics and ideas off of. So thanks a lot for that.
Thank you guys for having me. A lot of respect for both of you as tennis minds, and I enjoy the social media presence for both of you. I often share your stuff and use your stuff in the draw and on Monday Match Analysis, and kind of use it as a visual and something to bounce off of. So keep up the great work for both of you, and best success to the podcast and everything else in 2025.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you guys all know where to find Gill on Monday Match Analysis, and also join his Discord because I joined that recently, and there's quite a lot of subgroups in there, and yeah, it's fun. I mean, there's even one for challengers, so
Yes.
I have to
challengers
get
and
on Discord then.
UK and
Damon, let's do it. Come on
yeah,
now.
I,
Discord,
I I
let's
I
go.
barely use it, but actually I have it on my phone, I think, because in one of the places I work, they just made us like, I don't know, we would just basically exchange simple messages. But maybe, yeah, maybe I can join.
yeah,
Love
yeah.
it.
You
Thanks for
can,
the shout.
yeah, for sure. You certainly have and add a lot of color to that discussion, Damien, when it comes to the challengers thread for sure. So yeah. Well, looking forward to that as always, and yeah, best of luck to everything for 2025. And this is going to be like our final episode of the year, especially. So it's definitely a fitting one. Good timing. So yep,
Hopefully our first YouTube one as well, if everything goes
yes,
right.
yep, exactly. So you're
Nice,
your
nice.
first YouTube episode, Gil. So congrats.
Love it. Love it. Thank you guys.